We've already looked at different technologies, different population changes, all pertaining to this era of 1900 to the present. Our next goal is to look at the environment. And three factors have magnified the human impact on the Earth. So the world population has quadrupled in the 20th century from 1.6 billion to 7.2 billion in 2014. And we've already seen some of the factors leading to this, but keep in mind that population growth has slowed. Massive use of fossil fuels such as coal for electricity in the 19th century and oil for automobiles in the 20th century also is a factor that really exemplifies the human impact. Hydroelectricity, natural gas, solar, and nuclear power are also available as sources of energy. The third factor is enormous economic growth as an increasing population, along with new sources of energy, combine to produce global industrial output 40-fold. All right, it increased 40-fold from 1890 to 1990. There's an uneven spread of all three across the world, but economic growth came to appear possible and desirable almost everywhere in capitalist, communist, and developing countries alike. Human environmental disruptions have always had local implications, but these three factors now meant that they took on global proportions. Increasing numbers of poor led to the doubling of cropland and corresponding contractions of forests, grasslands, and wetlands to accommodate this population. This has also led to increasing rates of erosion. Large urban complexes have also led to diminished habitats, leading to numerous extinctions of plant and animal species. Even though there have been mass extinctions in the past, like with trilobites and dinosaurs, and humans previously hunted woolly mammoths to extinction, nothing on the scale that we've seen has ever taken place like this. The ecosystem has also increased the presence of plants and animals that have benefited from human activity, such as cattle, pigs, chicken, rats, wheat, and corn, which we saw in Unit 4, Transoceanic Interconnections. 90% of all plant activity now takes place in environments that are shaped by human action. Now, the spread of industry and subsequent dependence on fossil fuels has dramatically changed air, water, soil, and atmospheric quality. China's economic growth, which really began in the 1980s under leader Deng Xiaoping, was dependent on coal. So the result has been air pollution in many major cities and rivers. 12 of the world's 20 most polluted cities are actually in China. Waterways have also been polluted by herbicides, pesticides, oil, and sewage. In the United States, one of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie, was declared dead in the 1960s. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which you're looking at on screen, it's about 7 million square miles in the North Pacific, has trapped a large portion of mostly plastic garbage and is truly detrimental to marine life. In the Soviet Union, industrial pollution contaminated about half of the country's rivers by the late 1980s, and 20% of its population lived in zones that are legally considered to be ecological disasters. So some of these crises certainly have their roots in human actions. By the year 2000, scientific consensus on the occurrence of global warming or climate change, whatever you want to phrase it as, the consensus has been that it's the result of burning fossil fuels and the loss of trees. The 1970s is when scientists first became concerned about this, but their research drew on studies going all the way back to the 19th century. A scientific consensus had been reached by the end of the 20th century that the Earth's climate was warming and that humans were indeed playing a role in it. The burning of fossil fuels traps greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, and the loss of trees have eliminated a barrier that naturally removes carbon dioxide from the air. By 2014, carbon dioxide concentration in the air was over 400 parts per million, and had been about 275 parts per million prior to the Industrial Revolution. Keep in mind that 350 parts per million is considered to be a safe level. And this phenomenon has been linked to many changes, like rising sea levels, extreme weather events like floods and droughts, and even decreased crop yields. Some refer to it as a crisis that threatens the survival of our species. Now, climate change has also interacted with social conditions like poverty, inequality, and oppression, and has even contributed to major upheavals such as the Syrian Civil War, which began in 2011. The war has killed about 200,000 and led to millions becoming refugees. And the crisis actually came on the heels of a severe and prolonged drought and subsequent crop failures. In 2010 and 2011, severe weather conditions actually affected grain-producing areas all over the world, such as Canada, China, Russia, Argentina, and Australia, and it caused grain prices to spike. Now, the Middle East and North Africa are both dependent on grain imports. So the increase in food prices aggravated social unrest and helped lead to political protests like the Arab Spring. In 2007, several senior retired American military officers actually reported that climate change posed a threat to American national security because it contributed to instability in some of the world's most volatile regions. Now, environmentalism as a movement really began in the 19th century as a response to the Industrial Revolution. Romantic poets like William Blake wrote about dark satanic mills that threatened England's green and pleasant land. Gandhi even came around to this mode of thinking and did not want India to industrialize on the same level as the West. Environmentalism in its earliest form also showed concern for deforestation, for drought, and desertification, as settlers, lumberjacks, miners, and even plantation owners damaged the environment. This movement was especially prominent in the United States and Germany. It really didn't help, or I should say, didn't really draw a mass following, and it did help that it really counteracted the desires of the prominent capitalists of the time, but it was concerned with using science and state control to help manage and contain environmental damage. A big concern was also the protection of the remaining wilderness, and the first conference to discuss this was in London, and it was designed to protect African wildlife from European hunters. The man you see on screen, John Muir, was an early proponent of preserving wilderness, and even the opening of Yellowstone National Park in 1872 reflects this idea. Now, the concept of environmentalism didn't necessarily become a global phenomenon until the second half of the 20th century. It began in the West with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, and it exposed chemical contamination of the land with an emphasis on pesticides. This really helped reawaken the environmental movement on both sides of the Atlantic. About 10 years later, the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth warned of exhausting resources and foresaw the collapse of industrial society in the face of population and economic growth. And this began a movement that pushed back on unending economic growth and development. The true impetus for action, the impetus for action in and of itself, came from grassroots movements and citizen protest. Millions of people in the industrialized world had joined an environmental organization by the late 1990s, and these mostly local groups were dedicated to issues like pollution, nuclear power and testing, and eventually climate change. Proponents of what is known as deep ecology wants to stop putting man at the center of the earth and calls for treating them as the equivalents of other creatures. And environmental justice calls attention to unequal environmental impacts on the poor, minorities, and developing countries. Now, in Germany, Australia, and New Zealand, environmentalists entered politics as green parties. Teach-ins, demonstrations, and local activities were used as strategies of environmentalists. There's also been a rise in environmental consciousness in communist countries. China harshly silenced critics of the massive Three Gorges Dam project, but by the early 21st century, many groups grounded their arguments in Buddhist and Taoist thought that emphasized the harmony of mankind and respect for the natural order. Russian activists raised concerns over the sinking of the Aral Sea and pollution in rivers. And the nuclear disaster in Chernobyl in 1986 combined with Glasnost to give environmental activists a platform to speak out. Now, environmentalism did take root in the global South in the 1970s and 80s. And here it was more locally based and had fewer national organizations. It also involved those who were impoverished in direct actions and really expressed more concern over food, health, and basic survival than the outright rights of nature. Now, whereas the Western movement was a bit more concerned with protecting the forests where few people lived, in India, the movement sought to protect the farmers and herders living in areas most subject to extreme deforestation. The protest of a dam in India, all right, what you're seeing here, was concerned with displacement of the local populace, whereas a dam protest in the American Northwest would be concerned with protecting the salmon runs. These movements often clashed with national government projects, like local groups in the Philippines banding together to protest foreign-owned mining companies. And even today, there remain sharp conflicts between the global North and global South. Action on climate change would really require citizens and corporations in the North to adjust their ways of life. Northern efforts to control pollution and global warming could actually limit the South's industrial development, leaving the gap between the two intact. Developing countries perceive the developed ones as unwilling to give up their extravagance in really health matters. Nonetheless, global environmentalism has really come to symbolize the focus on the plight of all mankind. It is somewhat of a challenge to modernity itself, especially commitment to endless growth and growing the importance of ideas of sustainability and restraint.